From Mike Perry to Luis Pena, these are some UFC fighters that have been caught in domestic violence scandals. Right off the bat, Thiago Silva held his ex-wife at gunpoint. Back in 2014, Silva was arrested and charged with 2 counts of attempted murder. It all started when the Brazilian fighter threatened his wife, Thaisa, and her new partner with a handgun. Clearly shocked by the whole thing, they called the police. When the police arrived, Thiago fled the scene. After a standoff with the SWAT team, the Brazilian surrendered himself.
According to police, Thiago Silva threatened people at a jiu-jitsu school in Oakland Park last night, then barricaded himself inside his home.
It wasn't long after this that the UFC decided to terminate his contract. Thaisa later went on to say how her ex-husband's abuse of drugs, especially cocaine, led to this happening. She even stated how this wasn't the first time Silva had crossed a line with a weapon, and how earlier she had suffered an abortion after he beat her up. To think that they had been married for 13 years, things then took a shocking turn. Just 6 months after this incident, all charges against the boxer were dropped. Sources at the time stated that Thaisa had been uncooperative with the police and had returned to Brazil. This was a green signal for the UFC, and they decided to re-sign him.
You took him back. You originally said he'd never fight in the UFC again. Why'd you take him back?
I said he'd never fight in the UFC again when his SWAT team was around his house and things weren't looking too good for Thiago Silva.
But that wasn't the end of it. Days later, they dropped Silva once again and announced that some new information has come to light regarding the case. Suspicious, right? This incident only added to the bad reputation Thiago had built up in the UFC. It gets even more disturbing than this in the next one, guys. Mike Perry grounded and pounded ex-wife. Before all this, Mike Perry had been in the news for bizarre reasons, but all of those had to do with his behavior inside the octagon. However, in 2020, the fighter was accused by his ex-wife, Danielle, of domestic violence. The accusations she made were pretty disturbing, to say the least. Danielle spoke about how she had been physically assaulted by the boxer a couple of times, but the worst of it took place on 10th February 2020. After a night out, Perry came home and took his frustration out by assaulting her with punches. She spoke about how the abuse didn't stop until he got tired. Danielle then fled to her neighbor's house, where she was picked up by Mike's mother, who took Danielle to her house. After the news outlets got wind of this incident, Platinum went on record and denied all the allegations. But no matter what he said, it didn't get rid of the damning evidence that even included an audio clip of a 911 call his mother made, where she stated how he was being violent.
I'm out in the driveway and he's violent right now, and I'm scared for my life, and I don't know what he's going to do. He's revving his engine right now. His wife is inside my house, and I'm afraid he's going to hurt her.
Just days after this, both of them separated, and no charges were filed against the fighter. Unsurprisingly, Mike wasn't dropped from the UFC and continued to be booked for fights until his contract ended. That being said, this former UFC light heavyweight champion went crazy just hours after he was admitted to UFC Hall of Fame. Jon Jones abused ex-fiancée in front of their kids. The fighter and his fiancée, Jessie Moses, were in Las Vegas for Jon's induction into the UFC's Hall of Fame. The two had been together for almost 17 years and shared 3 children. Now, according to the police report, Moses stated that after Jon came back to their hotel room, he put his hands on her and pulled her hair but didn't hit her. It didn't take long for the police to figure out that some sort of physical assault had taken place, especially after seeing blood on Jessie's clothes and a bump with dried up blood on her lips. What made the whole thing even more disturbing was the fact that their children were present throughout all this. One of them even asked the guard at the hotel if he could call the cops. How messed up is that? Jones was clearly drunk out of his mind throughout the whole thing and even tried to resist arrest.
Yeah. You nerd. I hate you. I hate you.
It didn't take long for Moses to leave the UFC fighter after the incident. Later on, the UFC star had the domestic abuse charges against him dropped after he entered a plea deal with the prosecutors. Moving on, the next UFC fighter was already nicknamed the Violent Bob Ross before this incident happened. Luis Pena arrested for putting hands on 2 women. Pena was another name added to the long list of fighters arrested in 2021 on domestic violence charges. While in Florida, the fighter struck his girlfriend in the face multiple times, even happen when she was on the ground. What's more is that she wasn't the only victim. When a woman witnessed all this happening, she tried to intervene, and at this point, Luis punched her in the face with a closed fist, and she fell to the ground. The names of the women involved in this incident have been kept private by the law enforcement. His girlfriend later on revealed to the police how he had hit her just 2 days before this as well. An audio call made by the girlfriend was released, in which she told the dispatcher how Pena had choked her and hit her.
Was anyone strangled or choked?
I was.
Okay, you were strangled or choked?
Choked last night.
The fighter was then arrested and charged. The UFC took swift action against Pena and terminated his contract. Now, this next domestic violence scandal will definitely leave you shocked. Greg Hardy threatened to kill his ex-girlfriend. In May 2014, the former NFL player turned UFC fighter made headlines for all the wrong reasons. Greg was convicted of domestic violence after he threw his ex-girlfriend into a pile of semi-automatic assault weapons and then tried to strangle her and told her he's going to kill her. Let me just say that someone needs to get all these fighters some help. He later on obviously denied the whole thing, but the bruises on her body said otherwise. Hardy was then convicted on 2 accounts of domestic violence. He later on appealed the sentence and had the charges erased from his record, but only because his ex-girlfriend had failed to show up in court to give her testimony. When the disgraced NFL player was accepted by the UFC with open arms, the fans were outraged and called the decision wrong on every level. That's not all, guys. Even the UFC president has been accused of domestic violence. Dana White slapped wife in a club. This one shocked the UFC world. Nobody was expecting that the UFC president would get himself caught up in a domestic violence scandal, but then the damning video was released by TMZ. In it, the Whites are seen celebrating New Year's Eve in a dance club in Mexico. The UFC president is talking to his wife Anne. Now, Anne is clearly upset over something and has her face cupped between her hands. As Dana comes closer and tugs at her arm, his wife reacts by slapping him right across the face. It didn't just end there, guys. In a matter of seconds, Dana slaps her back. Not once, but twice. The UFC president was then seen pushing his wife on the ground and screaming, which I'm guessing were some not so pretty words at her. This scene made their friends jump in and separate the two from each other. So messed up. Right after the video came out, Dana apologized about the incident, and even Anne gave a statement defending her husband.
And, my wife and I have apologized to each other. We've apologized to our kids. And, this is one of those things that everybody's going to chime in. I could care less what anybody else thinks about this.
Just as the tradition is with most domestic violence cases in the UFC, the whole thing was swept under the rug, and Dana has so far not faced any consequences for his action, except for some backlash from the public. That's all I have for you today, guys. I'll see you in the next one.